The lights dimmed in the cavernous arena, a familiar cue for a man who had built his entire persona on the roar of the crowd. Donald Trump strode toward the podium, chin tilted high, scanning the seats, as if expecting thunderous applause to wash over him like it once did. But what greeted him was not the deafening chant of his name. It was silence broken only by scattered claps, half-hearted, hollow, almost embarrassed. Entire rows of seats stood empty, their absence louder than any boo could have been. The king who once commanded sold-out arenas now faced an audience that looked more like a tired afterthought. His smile flickered. He tried to force the bravado back onto his face, but even the cameras caught it. The faint twitch of uncertainty, the stumble in his confidence. He leaned closer to the microphone, voice booming with forced cheer. "We're going to win, bigger than ever before." Yet the crowd did not erupt. A few signs waved in the air, but most hands stayed still, clutching phones, recording the awkward spectacle. And then, the absence became undeniable. Melania. She was not there. The seat beside the stage, usually reserved for her regal but reluctant presence, sat empty. No elegant wave, no carefully rehearsed smile. Just an empty chair, a silent indictment. The woman who once stood dutifully in the shadows of his rallies had chosen absence over loyalty. It was humiliation dressed in daylight. Cameras panned across the void, commentators whispered, and social media feeds lit up instantly. "Where's Melania? Even she won't show up." The narrative was writing itself before he had even finished his first line. Trump's voice cracked for the briefest second as he pushed through his speech, clinging to old catchphrases that once electrified but now fell flat. Every syllable echoed against the emptiness, magnifying the spectacle of decline. He looked out at the crowd as if searching for proof that he still mattered, but the truth was staring him in the face. And yet, as humiliating as this scene was, the most devastating blow wasn't inside these four walls. The true humiliation, the one that would haunt him far beyond the rally, was waiting just outside the camera's frame. Poll numbers are not just numbers. They are lifelines. They are the invisible currency of politics, the measure of momentum, of belief, of inevitability. For Trump, those numbers had once been his greatest weapon. He flaunted them like trophies, waving polls above his head as proof that destiny itself had chosen him. But now, those same numbers had turned into daggers, each one cutting deeper into the myth of his invincibility. The headlines began to shift. What had once been a chorus of inevitability, Trump the frontrunner, Trump unstoppable, morphed into something darker. Words like collapse, decline, and weakness flashed across screens from CNN to conservative outlets that once never dared to doubt him. Rival candidates smelled blood in the water. Governors, senators, even political newcomers once dismissed as lightweights suddenly looked emboldened, their poll numbers inching upward as it slid down. Behind closed doors, the panic grew. Donors whispered to one another, nervous that their checks might be fueling a sinking ship. Wall Street backers who once treated him like a guaranteed investment began to hedge their bets. The phone calls from Republican power brokers grew sharper, more urgent. "What's happening out there? Why are you slipping?" In politics, loyalty is conditional, and with every percentage point lost, Trump's circle of allies shrank a little tighter. But this wasn't just about politics. This was about identity, about humiliation at the deepest level. Trump had built his image on being the winner, the fighter, the man who could never lose. To see his support bleeding away was to watch the foundation of his persona crumble in real time. The optics weren't just bad, they were existential. If the winner loses, then what remains? Crowds that once thundered with energy began thinning. The chants that once rattled the walls grew weaker, scattered, confused. And the polls told a brutal story. For the first time, voters in key states, the same states that had carried him to power, were abandoning him. Rival rallies began to swell, filled with young voters, immigrants, women, the very demographics he had spent years mocking and dismissing. The irony was sharp, undeniable. The people he had pushed aside were now the ones shaping the tide against him. And then came the moment nobody thought possible. The release of a poll so devastating, so brutal, that even Trump's most loyal advisors sat in stunned silence. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers told a truth that cut deeper than any insult hurled on a debate stage. The era of Trump might not just be weakening, it might be ending. But what happened next didn't just reveal political weakness. It exposed something far more personal, far more humiliating, a fracture not in his campaign, but in his own household. From the very beginning, Donald Trump crafted his identity not just as a businessman or a political outsider, but as the embodiment of arrogance turned into power. He relished humiliation, not as something to fear, but as a weapon to wield. Rivals weren't simply debated, they were mocked, reduced to nicknames and caricatures. Low-energy Jeb, crooked Hillary, little Marco. The crowd laughed, the media amplified it, and Trump stood tall at the center, convinced that humiliation was the sharpest blade in his arsenal. For years, it worked. He seemed untouchable. He insulted journalists, belittled war heroes, mocked people with disabilities, and dismissed entire communities with a wave of his hand. Each time, the backlash came, but it only seemed to feed his legend. The louder the outrage, the stronger his supporters clung to him, as if his arrogance was proof of strength rather than cruelty. He wore controversy like armor, convinced that no scandal, no slip, no insult could pierce him. Trump believed he had discovered a political cheat code, that humiliation was dominance, that cruelty was charisma, that spectacle was substance. The rules that bound other politicians, decorum, decency, accountability, simply didn't apply to him. And for a time, the results seemed to prove him right. He bulldozed through debates, steamrolled opponents, and turned every slight into an opportunity to crush. He wasn't just playing the game, he was rewriting it. But arrogance is a fickle currency. The more he spent it, the more reckless he became. At rallies, his mockery grew sharper, more unhinged. He openly taunted rivals at their weakest moments. Biden stumbling over words, Harris being interrupted on stage, DeSantis trying and failing to connect with voters. He thrived on ridicule, painting himself as the master performer in a theater of humiliation. And yet, in that same theater, seeds of irony were being planted. Because the very strategy that once made him untouchable also made him vulnerable. When your power comes from humiliation, what happens when the spotlight turns and you become the one being laughed at? The cracks began to show in small moments. When a heckler shouted from the stands and the crowd laughed, his face tightened. When late-night comedians turned his speeches into viral punchlines, his responses grew angrier, less controlled. The master of ridicule suddenly looked rattled by ridicule himself. And then there was Melania. For years, she had been the silent figure at his side, enduring the theater with a practiced smile, a carefully distant gaze. She was a prop in his performance of dominance, her presence used to project control and status. But even she, over time, began to shift. Small gestures, refusing to hold his hand, walking separately, avoiding interviews, signaled a quiet rebellion. What had once been dismissed as gossip suddenly looked like foreshadowing. The irony sharpened into spectacle. The man who built his empire on humiliating others was now the one humiliated. Empty seats, flat applause, a missing first lady. Each image landed like a punchline he couldn't control. His rivals didn't need to invent attacks. The humiliation was writing itself. Trump had long believed that power insulated him, that he could act with impunity, sneer at consequences, and still rise higher. But arrogance has a shelf life. And what happened next proved it. Heroes in politics don't always arrive in capes or with grand speeches. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, in the form of ordinary voters standing in line at polling stations, of communities determined to be heard, of dignified silence refusing to bow to arrogance. In this moment, the counterforce to Trump's dominance was not a single rival. It was a coalition of dignity itself, woven from democracy, the American voter, and the subtle but unmistakable rebellion of Melania Trump. For years, the story of America has been shaped by those who refuse to be silenced. Immigrants who crossed oceans with nothing but hope, workers who stood on picket lines demanding fairness, citizens who marched for rights they were told they didn't deserve. These are the people who breathe life into democracy, and they had grown weary of a man who mocked their sacrifice, belittled their struggle, and demanded loyalty without offering respect. Their quiet strength became the foundation of the resistance. And then there was Melania. Her story, too, reflected a tension between spectacle and silence. Born in Slovenia, raised in modest surroundings, she had once embodied the immigrant dream herself. She had navigated a new world, built a career, and eventually entered a life she could not have imagined as a child. A life defined by cameras, scrutiny, and a husband whose presence consumed every room. For years, she played the role expected of her, elegant, reserved, always present but rarely heard. Yet in that restraint, there was something powerful. People began to notice her subtle acts of defiance. The quick swat of a hand when he reached for hers on a tarmac. The slight delay as she walked behind him, refusing to match his stride. The way she avoided his campaign events, choosing absence over complicity. These weren't dramatic confrontations, but in the theater of Trump's politics, where loyalty was performed as spectacle, Her refusals spoke volumes. It wasn't just about a marriage. It was about symbolism. In a culture where Trump demanded submission, her small rebellions represented something larger. Dignity refusing to be overshadowed by arrogance. Viewers watching from home, particularly women and immigrants who understood the weight of silence, saw in her gestures a quiet kind of courage. She was not delivering speeches or rallying crowds, but her distance became its own form of protest. Meanwhile, democracy itself was stirring. Voters, often dismissed by Trump as the forgotten, began to organize, to show up in record numbers, to remind the nation that power does not belong to one man. It belongs to the people. The coalition forming against him wasn't loud or brash. It didn't need to be. Its strength lay in steadiness, in patience, in the belief that truth, when spoken through millions of ballots, could outlast the loudest lie. This was the great contrast. Trump's arrogance thrived on noise, on spectacle, on domination. The counterforce thrived on silence, resilience, and quiet dignity. While he screamed on podiums, the voters whispered to each other at kitchen tables, planned carpools to polling places, and shared stories of why their voices mattered. While he mocked opponents for weakness, Melania's absence reminded the world that true strength can be measured in what one refuses to endure. The irony was profound. Trump had always assumed that loyalty was his by default, that family, party, and base would bend endlessly to his will. But as poll numbers fell and seats emptied, even his inner circle began to fracture. Melania's choice to step back was not just personal, it was emblematic of a larger movement. She represented the millions who were quietly saying, "Enough." And so, the stage was set. The coalition of dignity, ordinary Americans, restless voters, immigrants with stories of sacrifice, and a first lady choosing absence, became the unexpected hero of this drama. They didn't mock, they didn't shout, they didn't degrade. They simply withstood. And in politics, as in life, there is power in endurance. And when she made her decision, to step back, to distance, it sent shockwaves no one could ignore. The debates had once been Trump's favorite arena. He thrived on chaos, wielding insults like weapons, interrupting with the force of a schoolyard bully who knew the teachers were too afraid to stop him. But this time, the stage felt different. He stormed in with the same swagger, the same hand gestures, the same booming promises of inevitable victory. But the crowd's energy was thinner, the applause less certain, the air heavy with anticipation of something about to crack. From the first question, his tone was sharper, almost desperate. He sneered at rivals who dared to rise in the polls, mocking one candidate's nervous smile, ridiculing another's voice. He repeated old lines, tried out new nicknames, but they landed with less force than before. The audience didn't laugh the way they once had. Instead, there were muffled chuckles, awkward pauses, glances exchanged between viewers who wondered if the old magic was gone. His rivals, long accustomed to being steamrolled, seemed to sense the weakness. They didn't shout back. They didn't meet fire with fire. Instead, they let him overextend, let him dig himself deeper with every insult hurled. One governor smirked as Trump ranted over his answer, then calmly said, "There he goes again, proving why so many are ready for a new chapter." The line wasn't shouted, but it drew a wave of applause. The contrast was glaring. Trump red-faced and shouting, his rival calm and composed, the audience responding not to noise but to steadiness. And then there was the absence that overshadowed everything, Melania. In years past, her presence at debates had been a silent symbol of legitimacy, a reminder that despite the scandals, the controversies, the mockery, he still had a partner by his side. This time, the chair reserved for her in the front row was empty. Cameras caught it. Commentators whispered about it. Viewers at home noticed instantly. The optics were devastating. Rivals didn't even have to mention it directly. The silence said enough. One candidate, pausing after a heated exchange, gestured subtly toward the front row and quipped, "Seems even some of our families are tired of this." The crowd erupted. It was a dagger cloaked in humor, but the message was unmistakable. Loyalty was fading, even within his own walls. Trump bristled, lashed out harder, his voice growing shrill as he tried to regain control. But the more he shouted, the clearer the contrast became. He wasn't the confident master of the stage anymore. He was the desperate man fighting to stop his own decline. Every insult felt like an echo of the past, a recycled script that no longer held the same power. And as the debate wore on, the sense of inevitability shifted. Trump's rivals began speaking with more confidence, more authority, as if they sensed they were watching the collapse of a myth in real time. Viewers at home could feel it too. The tide was turning. The man who once humiliated everyone else was now being undone by his own performance. But just when the chaos reached its peak, one calm, devastating counterattack landed, and it changed everything. It began with a pause. The kind of pause that felt intentional, almost theatrical. The debate stage had descended into chaos. Trump shouting over rivals, his voice cracking with desperation, the audience shifting uneasily in their seats. And then, one opponent, a rising figure with calm eyes and an unshakable tone, leaned slightly toward the microphone and waited. The room hushed, not because Trump had finished, but because the silence was louder than his rage. "Mr. Trump," the rival said evenly, "you keep talking about loyalty, about strength, about how everyone is still behind you. But let's be honest. Even your own family won't stand with you." It was a simple line. Not shouted, not dressed in theatrics. Just a statement of fact. But it landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled across the audience. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, catching the split second where his expression faltered, the widening eyes, the twitch at the corner of his mouth. The insult was not just political, it was personal. And everyone knew it. The crowd reacted with a mixture of laughter and applause, the sound rolling like a wave across the auditorium. It wasn't the forced laughter of partisans. It was raw, unfiltered, the kind of reaction that told the truth. The emperor's clothes were gone, and everyone could see it. For a moment, Trump tried to laugh it off, shaking his head with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He raised his hand dismissively, ready to fire back one of his trademark insults. But the line had cut too deep. The audience wasn't laughing with him, they were laughing at him. And that shift, that subtle but undeniable reversal, was unbearable. He sputtered, tried to summon the old fire. "That's fake news. Melania supports me 100%. She loves this country. She loves me more than anyone in this room could ever understand." But even as he said it, the words sounded hollow. The crowd didn't buy it. His rivals didn't flinch. And the cameras, merciless in their honesty, captured every second of his unraveling. Commentators in the spin room couldn't contain themselves. "Did you hear that?" One whispered into the microphone, voice tinged with awe. That was the moment. That was the dagger. Social media exploded instantly. Clips of the line, "Even your own family won't stand with you," began circulating before the debate had even ended. Memes appeared within minutes. Trump standing alone on stage, Trump pointing at an empty chair, Trump drowning in a sea of poll numbers. But the humiliation didn't stop with rivals and commentators. Former allies, long silent or cautiously supportive, began to break ranks. A prominent senator once considered one of Trump's fiercest defenders appeared on cable news just hours later, admitting, "The truth is, his grip on the party isn't what it used to be. Voters are tired. They're looking for someone new." That line, coming from the inside, felt like betrayal stacked on top of humiliation. The unmasking continued. One conservative talk show host, someone who had defended Trump at every scandal, played the clip repeatedly on air, laughing harder each time. "Even his own family won't stand with him," the host repeated, chuckling. "I mean, folks, how do you come back from that? That's a knockout punch." He denied the obvious shift in the crowd, accusing the media of planting fake clappers. Each denial only deepened the humiliation. For a man who thrived on dominance, the spectacle of fragility was devastating. The aura of inevitability, the myth that he could not be beaten, was shattered. No longer was he the untouchable figure towering over rivals. He was exposed. He was exposed, vulnerable, mocked not just by opponents, but by the very institutions and allies that had once protected him. The crowd sensed it. The rivals capitalized on it. And the nation watched as arrogance gave way to desperation, as the master of humiliation became its victim. The rival who had delivered the line didn't press further. They didn't need to. The silence afterward was victory enough. The audience's laughter, the commentators' gasps, the headlines already being written. It all compounded into one undeniable truth. The spell had been broken. And as the debate ended, the clips spread like wildfire. It leapt from television screens to Twitter feeds, from TikTok edits to Instagram reels. Millions watched, millions shared, millions laughed. What was once Trump's greatest strength, his ability to dominate the narrative, was ripped from him in real time. For the first time in years, he was no longer the storyteller. He was the story. And as the clip went viral, the internet crowned the moment a political obituary. It didn't take long. Before Trump even left the debate stage, the internet had already decided what the night meant. Within minutes, hashtags lit up the feeds. Hashtag Trump collapse. Hashtag where is Melania? And even the brutal hashtag alone at the podium. The clips replayed endlessly, some slowed down for dramatic effect, others remixed with sound effects, others set to music that mocked the moment. Late-night hosts sharpened their knives. One opened his monologue with a grin. Trump said his wife supports him 100%, which is true, if you round up from zero. The audience roared. Another quipped, remember when he called other candidates losers because their families didn't support them? Well, karma just RSVP'd. Laughter cascaded across living rooms nationwide. The master of mockery had become the punchline. Journalists piled on, their words as sharp as any rival's jab. Headlines screamed, collapse on stage, Trump mocked into silence, the aura shattered. In op-eds, writers dissected not just the polls but the symbolism of Melania's absence. For years, one columnist wrote, Trump's image was built on strength, unity, inevitability. Now he looks weak, alone, and human in the worst possible way. Donors noticed. Behind the scenes, panic calls were made. A megadonor reportedly told advisors, if he can't even keep his wife on stage, how's he supposed to hold the country together? Another froze a planned contribution, waiting to see how the dust settles. The money that once flowed freely toward Trump's campaign suddenly looked like a river, slowing to a trickle. Regular Americans joined in, their voices amplified across social platforms. One viral TikTok featured a teenager lip-syncing the debate moment, mouthing the words, even your own family won't stand with you, before cutting to a shot of an empty chair labeled Melania. The caption read, this aged badly. Millions liked it, laughed at it, shared it. On Twitter, one user wrote, Trump's always been the bully at the lunch table. Tonight, someone finally stood up to him, and the cafeteria laughed. The tweet racked up hundreds of thousands of likes. Another posted simply, polls don't lie, chairs don't clap, wives don't fake it. Brutal, concise, and devastating. Cable networks played the clip on loop. Analysts, many of them once cautious about declaring Trump's downfall, leaned in with visible excitement. This feels different, one anchor declared. Not just another gaffe, not just another insult. This was a moment of cultural rupture. The spell is breaking. On rival networks, even conservative commentators admitted the damage was severe, maybe irreversible. Everywhere, the laughter and the memes carried the humiliation further than any rival could on their own. Because humiliation wasn't just televised, it was personalized, replayed, memed, mocked, and embedded into the nation's collective memory in real time. And through it all, Melania's absence became the haunting refrain. Photos circulated of her at other public events, carefully distant, never by his side. Paparazzi shots of her looking poised, detached, even serene were contrasted against Trump's red-faced rants. The message was clear. While he unraveled, she rose above the spectacle. The silence spoke louder than words. No statement, no appearance, no smile beside him to suggest unity. Just distance. And in politics, distance is devastating. For the first time in his career, Trump faced a humiliation that wasn't manufactured by enemies, but magnified by those closest to him. And the most brutal blow didn't come from an opponent. It came from silence at home. History doesn't always announce itself with a grand parade. Sometimes it slips in quietly, tucked between trending hashtags and breaking news tickers. But every so often, a moment arrives that makes the entire nation pause and realize something has shifted. Trump's collapse was one of those moments. For years, he wielded arrogance like a weapon, sneering at opponents, mocking the weak, belittling the vulnerable. He built a brand on domination, on the idea that strength was measured in insults, that power meant never apologizing, never bending, never admitting fault. To his followers, it was intoxicating. To his critics, it was corrosive. But for a long stretch of American politics, it seemed unstoppable. Until it wasn't. What unraveled on that debate stage was more than just a bad night. It was the slow cracking of an aura that had been cultivated with bravado and fear. Poll numbers, once the evidence of inevitability, now betrayed him. Rivals surged. Donors wavered. The same headlines that once glorified his dominance now chronicled his downfall with clinical precision. But it wasn't the numbers alone that told the story. It was the absence. Melania's refusal to stand by his side became more than a personal choice. It became a metaphor. For years, she had been cast in the role of silent witness to his bluster, a polished figure in the background of his chaos. Her step back, her distance, resonated far beyond the marriage. It was symbolic of America itself, an America exhausted by the drama, choosing dignity over spectacle, silence over humiliation. And the irony was undeniable. The man who built his career mocking others' weakness was now the one mocked. The man who prided himself on loyalty found his own household fractured. The man who claimed to embody strength stood exposed, fragile, desperate. Commentators drew the parallels immediately. Every strong man believes he's untouchable, one historian observed on cable news. But arrogance always carries an expiration date. And Trump's is here. The footage played over and over, not just because of what was said, but because of what was felt. In the crowd's laughter, in the rival's piercing line. Even his own family won't stand with him. There was a sense of justice, of tables finally turning. For millions of Americans, particularly immigrants, minorities, and those who had borne the brunt of his rhetoric, it felt like vindication. A release of years of pent-up anger, fear, and defiance. But this wasn't just about Trump. It was about a culture shift. A reminder that politics is more than theater, more than slogans and rage. It is, at its core, a reflection of values, of what a nation chooses to reward and what it chooses to reject. For too long, fear had been rewarded. For too long, arrogance had masqueraded as leadership. But dignity, patient and quiet, had been waiting. And dignity outlasts arrogance. Always. That was the lesson in Melania's absence, in the silent protest that spoke louder than any speech. It wasn't fire or fury that dealt the final blow. It was withdrawal, distance, a refusal to play along with the spectacle. Poll numbers reinforced what Americans already felt in their gut. The story was over. The magic was gone. No insult, no slogan, no rally could disguise the unraveling. Trump's empire had been built on fear, on the illusion of inevitability, but empires built that way are always temporary. They collapse not from external attack, but from within, from the arrogance that blinds them to their own fragility. And so, the obituary wrote itself. Pundits declared the moment the end of an era. Editorial boards spoke of a turning tide. Social feeds filled with a sense of catharsis. The bully had been humbled, the spell broken. But perhaps the most striking part of the story was its simplicity. No dramatic courtroom battle. No climactic confrontation in the streets. Just empty seats, flat applause, bad poll numbers, and a wife who chose not to stand beside him. It was enough. In the end, history will remember Trump not for the empire he thought he built, but for the way it unraveled, suddenly, humiliatingly, inevitably. His collapse was not marked by strength, but by silence. Not by loyalty, but by absence. Not by power, but by fragility. And the lesson echoes far beyond one man. It speaks to the deeper truth of democracy itself, that arrogance may dominate the headlines, but dignity shapes the future. That bluster may rally crowds, but it cannot outlast the quiet strength of people who refuse to be humiliated any longer. The story closed with a kind of poetic justice. The man who believed himself untouchable was touched. The man who believed himself inevitable was discarded. The man who believed himself immortal in politics was rendered obsolete by the simplest of truths. In the end, every empire built on fear collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. And so, the headline writes itself. Trump dying in the polls, Melania shunned in public humiliation. But behind the spectacle, there's a deeper story. A story about dignity, values, and the quiet power of stepping away from arrogance. Because in politics, just as in life, humiliation isn't only about what happens on stage. It's about what it reveals, who we are, what we stand for, and what we will no longer tolerate. Melania's absence wasn't just a personal choice. It was a mirror held up to America, reminding us that sometimes silence speaks louder than applause, and dignity will always outlast ego. Backhand index pointing right. If you believe arrogance must never outweigh dignity, share this story. Subscribe, and join us as we uncover the truth behind the drama.